Well, thank you so much to Jen and everybody who organized this. Okay, so mine is a case of the hijacked class. So I'm going to first ask you to do something for me. I want you to close your eyes, picture a philosopher. Got it? Okay, open your eyes. How many of you pictured a man? How many of you pictured a white man? How many of you pictured maybe an old dead white man? Right, so if that's what you pictured, you are not alone. I had this revelation a little over 8 years ago. I was a couple years out of grad school. I realized that my introduction to philosophy class, the class that is there to introduce students to the field of philosophy, was entirely white men. No women, no philosophers of color. I was teaching Plato, Descartes, Hume, Russell, Churchland, white guy after white guy after white guy. How could my students think anything else except that the only people to make important contributions to philosophy were white men? I was shocked. Diversity and representation are very important to me. Those of you who know me, it is very important to me. And I myself was reading scholarship and attending conference panels about women philosophers and philosophers of color and philosophers, queer philosophers. So how did I not notice this? What happened? Why was I teaching my students a canon made up of only white men? Well, this is my aha moment. I was taught a canon of only white men. Most of my philosophy education was focused on the thoughts and traditions of white European and American men. But as we know, philosophy is so much more. Now, I knew I didn't have time to overhaul my entire syllabus by the next iteration of Introduction to Philosophy, but something had to be done. So what could I do? I decided that I would just squeeze in to my syllabus a couple of papers on race and gender that I was familiar with. And this I thought was not going to be a bad start. One of the articles I gave the students was written by Sally Hasslinger, a very well-known philosopher in feminist philosophy. In the paper, she argues that sex and gender are social constructions. It's a really good article, maybe a little bit controversial. The problem was that the paper just popped up out of nowhere on a syllabus in a sea of white male philosophical traditions. I didn't contextualize it. I didn't prepare students for it. And as you might imagine, things did not go well. Now, it started off okay. Like, we had a good, interesting discussion. But then one student raised his hand and insisted, against a well-reasoned philosophical argument, that the author was just wrong. He said, sex and gender are unchangeable, trans people are just mistaken about their identities. But here's the thing, he wasn't engaging in the arguments in the paper. He wasn't interested in learning more. He was only interested in shutting down the discussion and filling the space with his own views. Now, I can't say that I was surprised. This is what I was dreading. And even though I anticipated this very scenario, that in fact did happen, I wasn't at all prepared on how to handle it. And I didn't handle it well. What did I do? Okay, well, I spent half the class, 30 minutes out of a 65-minute class, debating this one student. Now, I pulled out all of my philosophy tricks. I asked the student questions. I pointed out possible biases. I challenged his assumptions. I explained to him the facts. I channeled the spirit of Socrates himself. And still, I felt like I failed. Not just him, but the other students in the class. At the end of the class, I was exhausted. I felt like I had just gone through battle. And honestly, I thought about taking the material off my syllabus. I thought maybe I'm just not the right person to be teaching this material. But then, one student approached me after class and said, this was the best class that I have ever had at Union. How is that possible? It's impossible. I was so confused, and I sat there trying to reconcile the fact that I didn't feel like this went pedagogically well at all with the fact that this student said it was the best class that he had ever had at Union. The conclusion I came to was that even when done poorly, students they need these conversations to happen in the classroom, even when they're done badly. They need to have these conversations in academic settings where someone with training and critical thinking is guiding the conversation. So despite the temptation to go back to my safe, whitewashed syllabus, I decided in that moment I would keep pushing myself to diversify the curriculum, and I would figure out how to do it better, so that never again will a student hijack my class. So now the question is, how do we diversify our syllabi when the syllabi we were taught might not have been very diverse? How do we teach our students the rich scholarship that's out there that will equip them to tackle the challenges of their time and show them that there is a way forward in talking about these really difficult topics? Here's a few things that I've learned since that first class. First, just name the elephant in the room, right? In my situation, when I teach philosophy, and I teach ancient Greek philosophy, I just say, look, the philosophical canon is made up of mostly old white men, but that was a choice. It didn't have to be like that, right? There's a lot of good philosophy that was done by other people, not just white men. And it's not even necessarily that white men were making the best philosophy. So the second thing I do is I talk about our biases. I just say it right out. Where do our biases come from? How do these views creep in? And how do they affect the way that we approach the material? And I do this in a number of ways. One of them is actually like games, like Picture a Philosopher. A little bit more complex than that. And then third, I set the parameters. I'm very clear now, at the very beginning of the course, about what is up for debate and what's not up for debate. We have only a short time with our students, and we get to decide as educators, what kind of discussions are going to be productive. So for instance, in addition to ancient Greek, I teach a class on sex and power, which has nothing to do with ancient Greece. In that class, we begin by saying that certain things are just not up for debate. In that class, we say gender inequity is real, trans people are people, systemic oppression is a problem, and that's our starting point. And once students understand that that's the starting point, then we can really get into some interesting discussions. So this is really mostly for faculty. If you're thinking about changing up your syllabus, tackling difficult topics, but you're worried about your class getting hijacked, my advice is do it anyway. Learn from my mistakes. Learn from your mistakes. Because at the end of the day, to be honest, I don't really remember much about the student that hijacked my class, but I do remember the student who said it was the best class he ever had. Thank you.